Hello everyone, Steve the Amateur Historian coming to you a little bit under the weather. I don't know, my voice probably sounds a little bit more hoarse to you than it normally does. It's a strange bug. I don't really know. I just know that I'm coughing from time to time and I never cough, aside from, choking on something, unless I'm sick. I do not cough. And my throat's been off and on scratchy, just wintertime. But one thing that this bug has not done is it has not sapped away all of my energy. And because of that, I have the strength to come to you now to bring you another crazy story from the history of Oregon. This is one of Oregon's oldest, still technically unsolved murders, even though a lot of people think they know who the killer is. It still, to this day, looms unsolved because that particular individual was never officially charged nor obviously convicted for what happened in the dead of winter, Central Oregon, 1924. I am talking about the Lava Lake murders. And there goes my voice.
Steve the Amateur Historian.
So, for the winter of 1923 going into 1924, three men took on essentially seasonal work. At least two of them were actually worked in the logging trade and were not fur trappers. They just took this job on as essentially a winter job. These three men were Edward Nichols, who was 50, Roy Wilson, who was 35, and Dewey Morris, who was 25. So, pretty vast age difference, but these three men took on work in the fur trade in the Deschutes kind of national forest area. And specifically, they were in the vicinity of two lakes. There was Big Lava Lake and Little Lava Lake. These were this area was located just southwest of Bend, Oregon. That was definitely the largest town in that area. And they were located directly south of the Three Sisters. So they were kind of in the vicinity of the Deschutes National Forest and kind of the Cascade Range that ran along Central Oregon there. And the fur trade had actually proven to be a pretty successful, lucrative venture for these three men. Everybody who saw them, December into January, said that they were in very jovial moods. The trade had gone great. And then suddenly, these three men vanish without a trace. And the biggest issue in all this is that it's the middle of nowhere, and these three men are actually staying in this cabin alone. Now, what made this case so complicated, because these men, all three of them, vanished in January of 1924. They're not found until April. And one of the main reasons for this is while they are doing their seasonal winter fur trapping work, they're staying at a cabin owned by a local guy named Edward Logan. And in exchange for them staying at this cabin, they agreed to watch over some foxes that he owned to make sure that they were taken care of. So these three men were more or less just kind of out there on their own doing their job. It was just the three of them. So if anything was to happen to them, it's not like there'd be somebody waiting at home who, when they didn't return one night, would say, hey, what's going on? And immediately a search begins. If these guys vanished, it was literally going to take somebody else noticing, hey, we haven't seen or heard from one or all of these guys in a while before some action is taken. And that ultimately happened when Dewey Morris's brother started getting a little concerned that he hadn't heard from his brother in so long. And he, along with a few others, ventured to the area of Lava Lake to see what was going on. And they found the cabin in a state like it had been seemingly abandoned all at once. It wasn't ransacked, according to what I've seen. It wasn't like someone had broken there and kidnapped people and took whatever they could from the place. It was quite the opposite. There was burnt food in pots on the stove, like in the middle of cooking a meal, everyone just left. The main table had been set for a meal. I mean, seriously, it looked like in the middle of preparing for breakfast, lunch, dinner, what have you, everyone just left. It was very, very suspicious. And from that point, it went from suspicious to troubling. As Dewey Morris's brother and these other searchers moved outside of the cabin and started searching the area around there, they noticed that Edward Logan's foxes were all gone. The pen was empty. And while they searched the pen, they found a claw hammer in the pen that was covered in blood. Now, at the time, was this fox blood or was it human blood? Who's to say, but it's definitely troubling when you find something like that in the vicinity of a cabin where these three men are supposed to be, one of whom is your brother, and it's just empty. It's been abandoned. And something else that was also noticed, in addition to the foxes being gone, was the main sled that these guys used to, if they caught any animals, they took the sled out there, put the dead animals on there, and brought them back. Or, if they shaved their fur off out there, they would bring the fur back on this sled. It was their, transportation hub. So they weren't just going to leave this somewhere. This wasn't going to just get forgotten. It was a necessary item for these guys for the work that they were doing, and that was also gone. So it's very interesting. The most positive light you can put on it is these guys suddenly on a whim decided to go out and check their fur traps. So they left in the middle of preparing a meal, took their sled, went out and about. But something else that was noticed while the cabin was being searched was it didn't appear that anything that would normally be taken with, extra warm clothes, anything to, shear the fur off these animals, none of that stuff was missing. So it was hard to argue that perhaps these guys had just left and were on some fur trapping mission. And it's like, what? They went on a mission to check their fur traps and whatnot, and they didn't come back for weeks or months. They said that, the utensils that had been used had been growing mold on them because they'd been sitting unwashed for so long. This cabin had clearly been empty for a very long time. Now, it's important to note here, the last person, and it doesn't seem like he ever came up as a possible suspect, the last person to see these three men alive was a guy named Alan Wilcoxon, who was a local resort owner, as I understand it, who was making a trek from one location to another, and this cabin was in that vicinity. And he stopped off there January 15th, 1924. And he stayed there that evening with the three men, stayed there overnight, left the following morning of January 16th. He said the men, as everyone else had said, were in high spirits, in a jovial mood. The fur trade was going very well for them. And Wilcoxon left. And these three men hadn't been seen since. Now, you always, always have to at least kind of suspect the last person who sees people alive as being, maybe that's the killer. If these are, at least responsible for the disappearance of these three men. But it doesn't seem like Wilcoxon ever came under suspicion for that. So it's believed that the disappearance happened sometime between January 16th and January 22nd, 1924. The initial impression was that it had happened a little earlier, possibly as early as December of 1923. But then when Wilcoxon's story came out, they knew it had to be no earlier than sometime later in the afternoon or possibly the evening of January 16th that these men could have gone missing. And because the cabin that they were staying in was so close to the lava lakes, of which again there was Big Lava Lake and Little Lava Lake, that area was searched pretty quick. And once it became clear through a check of the cabin and the area around it that there was a potential problem here, there was potential foul play, the Deschutes County authorities got involved, some of whom knew the fur trade very well and knew where the fur traps would likely be put, so they were very beneficial in this search. And as the searching of the lakes began, there was a few suspicious things of note. There were several fox carcasses found in the vicinity of these lakes that had been recently had their fur shaved off by someone who was obviously very skilled in doing that. Maybe it was one of these three men. Who knows for certain. But they also noticed there was a part of the lake, because again, it's Central Oregon in winter. It gets cold, and it's cold for a long time. And even though it's April by this point that these searches are happening, it's still pretty cold up there, and there's still a lot of ice on the lake. But this lake probably froze over for the most part during the winter, and they noticed a part of the lake that was still frozen over. They could actually see where a hole had been cut in the ice, and then over time had been filled in and like refrozen over just naturally over time. But it was obvious that a hole had been cut. So the suspicion quickly starts to become, was this hole cut in the ice and was something deposited in the water? Is that where we're going to find these three men? And as the search continues, it gets more and more bleak. Some pools of blood were found along a trail leading to the lake, and a human tooth was even found. And what was possibly most troubling and most damning was the sled that these three men used for their fur trapping work was discovered down by the lake where it had been left there. And it had a bunch of dried blood on it. So investigators have to start getting very nervous, very concerned that they are going to find a very troubling end to this case of these three missing fur trappers. And one of the benefits of it being April and it's, shifting into spring from winter was, again, a lot of the ice that had, covered the lake had started breaking. It was slowly beginning to thaw, and it was just broken up enough that authorities could go out on a boat and actually go out on the lake to try to do a more detailed search around. And it was in the process of doing this that they discovered the three bodies of Nichols, Wilson, and Morris. So the presumption is pretty clear that that hole that was cut in the ice was likely done to deposit their bodies, and they would be hopefully trapped under the ice and possibly, lost forever. But the ice had cracked just enough that their bodies were able to come to the surface of the water, and their bodies were retrieved. Now, that being said, these guys weren't just drowned. They weren't just thrown fully alive into a hole and they just, drowned or, froze to death under the ice, which would be a horrible enough way to die. But as the autopsies came out, it was obvious that these men had all been shot and beaten. Like, this was a pretty brutal murder on all counts. it would be discovered through the autopsies of each one that Nichols was shot in the face with a shotgun blast. They said the lower half of his face had just been blown away pretty much, and he'd also suffered another bullet wound in his head. So he'd been shot multiple times in the head. Wilson had been shot in the right shoulder and had also been shot in the back of the head. That presumably the shot that killed him. And Nichols, having been shot multiple times in the head, that's what killed him. And then Morris, the youngest of the bunch, had been shot in the left forearm and had also had his skull fractured. And it's presumed that that had been done by use of a hammer or something similar to that. It's been the presumption that a hammer was also involved because there was clear signs of blunt force trauma experienced by these three men in addition to the bullet wounds that they received. It was abundantly clear that a shotgun and a handgun, revolver of some kind, had been used in this killing. And it's believed that there were likely more than one person involved. I'm going to get back to this in a moment, that there's been a suggestion that there were multiple people involved, which makes sense when you think there was multiple guns involved. I mean, to use a shotgun, you pretty much need both your hands. I mean, you can do it like in the movies where you cock it and shoot with one hand and shoot with a pistol with the other, but I mean, if you've got, 3 live men that you're firing at, you want to be as focused as you can as possible. So it seems like, if there's 2 guns involved, there's probably 2 men involved, and it would be pretty impressive for one guy to take out 3 other guys that easily. So anyway, that's a theory, at least, that whoever did this, there was more than one person involved. Which then brings us to the suspects. There was a local, I guess he was a moonshiner, and he was the first suspect. He lived only a short distance from the Lava Lakes, and he came under suspicion very quickly, and almost just as quickly he was dismissed as a suspect when he provided an alibi for his whereabouts during this time period. That apparently that alibi was fairly impenetrable, if you can say that. And so that went by the wayside pretty quickly. But not too long after, Edward Logan, the guy that owned the cabin where Wilson, Nichols, and Morris had been staying, he brought to the authorities' attention a guy that he knew by the name of Collins. That was the last name of this guy. And Collins had reportedly robbed Logan. He'd stolen an expensive fur coat of his. They'd had altercations. Collins had made numerous threats on him. And he said that this guy was bad news. And it would later come out that this guy, Collins, had an even bigger beef with Nichols. So it comes out that Edward Nichols, apparently Collins had stolen something from him. He'd actually had him charged with theft. And I know that they had had arguments, very heated arguments, over a stolen wallet. I haven't been able to connect whether the stolen wallet and this theft that Edward Nichols claimed that Collins was responsible for, whether those are the same thing or that was just a whole other thing. But these men did not get along, and Collins showed up at that cabin and would get very confrontational with Edward Nichols. And he was heard by the people there to say that he was going to come back and kill Nichols. He literally threatened the guy's life. And here we are, just a little ways down the road, and Edward Nichols is one of the 3 men who's found dead, in the ice of a lake. And just as quickly as this name Collins came to attention, the authorities discovered that this was simply an alias. Yeah, this guy who had gone by the name of Collins was actually a guy named Charles Kimsey. And this guy was a real piece of work, and he came under suspicion very quickly once the bodies of these three men were discovered and they realized they had a full-fledged murder case on their hands. Charles Kimsey had obviously been in the Central Oregon area at some time. He had had encounters with Nichols and Logan, serious altercations. But furthermore, only months before, back in 1923, Kinsey had had a trial date set for trying to murder a stagecoach driver. He'd actually hailed this stagecoach driver to, seemingly give him a ride somewhere, and in the process of that, he bound this guy, poisoned him, and threw him down a well. And somehow the stagecoach guy survived and put the finger on Kinsey, and Kinsey was supposed to go on trial in presumably 1923 for this bizarre attempted murder scheme. I don't know why he did it. I don't know if the stagecoach driver had money on him. I don't know if this guy had slept with Kinsey's sister. I don't know what the motive was, but it was a bizarre killing. And of course, right before he goes to trial, Kinsey splits. So he's still on the loose when these murders presumably happen, and they're very brutal murders. And I know one local law enforcement officer described Kimsey as so despicable that he wouldn't put any crime past him. And obviously this guy had already tried to attempt to kill somebody else. He has motive because he hates this Logan guy and this Nichols guy. He's threatened Nichols' life, and that's been seen by multiple people. So if he shows up to exact that revenge that he said he was going to get, and Nichols is hanging out with these other two guys that are at his cabin, I mean, someone as deplorable as Charles Kimsey, he's probably just going to kill those other two as well, because otherwise they're witnesses. So there's motive there. And the theory looms that Charles Kimsey showed up to exact his revenge and brutally murdered all three of these men. It's believed by the authorities that, did the case, that at least two of the three men weren't killed in the cabin, but rather lured somewhere. And the idea that there was more than one person involved is actually supported by newspaper reports from around the time that these bodies were discovered, and they were researching the lakes and the cabin, and it supported that idea that the shooting did not occur inside the cabin, which I know I will be discussing in my conclusion a little bit, how the cabin didn't show any signs of being ransacked. There was no blood in it. There was no signs of a crime happening in there, but that these men left in the middle of cooking food, and they were discovered dressed not to be out in the elements. So they obviously weren't dressed to be outside, so it's more that they seem to have been lured outside. And I know in some of the articles I read that that's kind of the idea, is that Kimsey presumably shows up, and some of them suggested with, other people, showed up there, lured the men outside. He probably called out to Nichols or to all of them, hey, I'm here, get out here. And they step out on the porch, or if the cabin even had a porch, but they step outside, and that's when likely the murder occurs. It seems like there wasn't some kind of all-out fracas that happened. It's likely that they led the men to a certain place where they could fully have control of them. That could explain why, there's the bloody claw hammer that's found in the fox pen on the other side of the cabin. But yeah, there's even, right after the men were discovered, they looked at the crime scene and how these men went from being in the cabin to being outside to being on the sled to the ice underneath the lake, and they all suggest the probability that there was one, if not more, accomplices along with Kimsey or the primary assailant. Based on all the evidence that Kimsey shows up, possibly with an accomplice. Now, this is where that whole more than one person was involved thing. You can argue Kimsey was, you know, the leader of this, but some people believe that another guy who went by the name of Jackson may have helped him. Now, this guy's name was Ray Van Buren Jackson in full, and he'd actually had a really sketchy past, and he had been mixed up with multiple murders kind of in that Lava Lake area that predated the disappearance and death of these three guys in 1924. So he had the background, and he was known to be at least an acquaintance with Charles Kimsey. So here's another guy that definitely had a taste for crime and murder in him. It's been theorized, especially in a book that was written on the case, it's been theorized that this guy may have helped Kimsey with this murder, and especially the aftermath. And Jackson, as far as I know, committed suicide in 1938, so he didn't live too long after these murders happened, and he never really came under suspicion, so nobody ever really talked to him about it. But one of the reasons you kind of feel like Kimsey, if he was, you know, the guiding light on this, would need an accomplice is he has 3 people he has to kill, but he also has 3 bodies he needs to transport. I mean, 3 grown men. We're talking like, you know, probably 500-600 pounds worth of people that he obviously, again, if you go by how the evidence is, he murdered them. He wanted to get rid of the bodies. You know, Logan's going to come back at some point. He doesn't need to find these dead bodies on his property. Him and Kimsey, again, had a rough, tumultuous relationship, if you can call it that. And he probably would have put the finger on Kimsey right away, which, I mean, technically he did when he pointed out that this Collins guy may have been involved. But obviously the objective was to get rid of the bodies, which means you need to put these bodies of these men on the sled, hoist them over your shoulder, and drag them all the way down to the lake. And then cut a hole in the ice and then shove all the bodies in. That's a lot of work to do for one guy. So whether it's Ray Van Buren Jackson who helps Kimsey or anyone else, it seems like he would have likely had an accomplice. Just for how, you know, rough this work would have been. And when you're one guy heading up to a cabin where there's 3 guys there, and they're already they kind of know you have it out for them, so they're kind of ready for you to show up at any given time. It's really kind of foolish to show up by yourself to take on 3 guys. So logistically, you'd think this guy would have an accomplice with him. But beyond his taste for murder, Kimsey was also a fellow fur trapper, so he was almost competition with these guys. Any animals that Nichols, Wilson, and Morris find, that's animals that are being taken away from him. But what is of most interest is the presumptions of what Charles Kimsey did after the murders. It's interesting. January, I believe, 22nd, 1924. So it's almost a week after these 3 men are seen for the last time and presumably murdered only shortly after this visit from Wilcoxon on January 15th. So January 16th, 17th, somewhere in there, these murders happen. And if it is Kimsey, it's believed that he likely walked the Mackenzie River Trail, which is this really long kind of historical trail that ultimately gets you towards the Eugene, Springfield area, about 100 miles south of Portland. And from there, he would have hitched a ride, presumably, up into Portland, because only a week or so after these 3 men are seen for the very last time, an officer in the city of Portland encounters Kimsey. There's no doubt in his mind that it's Charles Kimsey. And Kimsey approaches him directly. He's got this big bag over his back that we later find out has a bunch of fur in it. You know, probably fur he stole after killing these 3 guys. And he asks him, where are there any, fur traders in this area? Where's a place I can go to in town to sell my fur? And he recommends this place on, from what I've read, it says 3rd Avenue in Northwest Portland. So in the heart of what is now Chinatown today, there was a fur trading establishment run by a guy whose last name was Schumacher. And it's presumed then that Kimsey takes the furs to Schumacher, he sells them to him for $110, and then Kimsey vanishes. And this is what really puts Kimsey on the radar as the suspect in these 3 murders, is authorities hear about Kimsey coming up to Portland. They have this police officer identifying him, but then when they go and visit Schumacher at his fur trade establishment, they look at his records where he puts a record of, the people that he's selling and trading with. And it's noted that the guy who came in to sell these furs was using the license of Edward Nichols. So he was using the license of a dead man who he'd been having quarrels with. He'd had to have gone to the cabin and attained that license somehow, and it's unlikely that Nichols would have just handed it over. So we now know whoever did this, whether it's Kimsey or anyone else in the world, this is the suspect. This person was in that cabin and got a hold of the license, the fur trading license of a dead man. And of the 3 men who die, it's the one that Kimsey has the biggest issue with. I mean, talk about brazen. You use the fur trading license. I mean, he probably had to, I guess. Even if he had his own license, he probably didn't want people knowing where he was, having just killed a bunch of people. He needed to make some bucks, but he probably wanted to stay on the lam at the same time. But you use the fur trading license of a guy who just died. Now, he probably thought at the time, no one's ever going to find these bodies. This is one of the things about, a murder like this that happens almost 100 years ago in an area that's still very desolate. It's a time where there's not a lot of people around. It's a very open rural space as it is. It's very unlikely that these bodies were ever going to be found. And fortunately, a few people cared enough about the whereabouts of at least one of these men that they started searching. And that got the local county sheriff's office involved. And they were able to find these 3 men. But at the time, if Kimsey was the killer, he probably was thinking, no one's ever going to find these bodies. They weren't going to do a background check to verify that he was this Nichols guy that was on his license. So he probably thought he was in the clear when he did this. But then, of course, the bodies do turn up, and you have this evidence of Kimsey selling furs and using the name of a dead man that he had a vendetta against. The problem is, right after this, right when the police put up a reward and say, we want this guy found to stand trial for this murder, collection of murders, and he still got this attempted murder from back in 1923, Charles Kimsey just vanishes. And no one can find him. Again, it's the 1920s. It's a lot easier to just up and vanish than it is these days. They didn't have the internet. They didn't have tracking devices. They didn't have, pretty much everything they have to try to track people. They couldn't tap phones back in I mean, maybe they could, but it was definitely a lot more not as readily developed as it is, like any technological thing is that helps solve crime and find criminals today. And it's almost a decade later, it's February 1933 before he's finally found living in a small town in Montana. And he's immediately shipped back to Oregon, predominantly to be hopefully tried for these 3 Lava Lake murders. The 1923 attempted murder was in the background at that point. They weren't even really thinking about that. And the problem is, when all is said and done, they had a good amount of circumstantial evidence, but that's all they had to try Charles Kimsey on. And the biggest problem, the key witnesses, the police officer that encountered him, and the Schumacher guy that ran this fur trading business, those were the 2 biggest witnesses to show that Kimsey in days after these three men vanished, shows up with a bunch of fur and, you know, the fur trading license of a guy who's now dead and sold fur there, which that was the key element that put the focus on him as the guilty party. And the officer couldn't quite identify him. 10 years had passed. Kimsey had apparently lost a lot of hair. He was looking a lot older, a lot more grizzly. He was balding. He just didn't look the same. And Schumacher couldn't quite identify him as the man who had sold him these furs either. So they couldn't get a case on this guy because the two key witnesses just weren't quite certain. You know, before, back in 1924, the officer said he was dead certain it was Charles Kimsey. So I think at the end of the day, I think we can still all agree, everyone still is pretty convinced it was Charles Kimsey and that he did murder these three guys and then show up with the license of one of them and fur that he probably stole from them. Again, there were a bunch of foxes, dead foxes in the area of Lava Lake that had their fur cut off. Maybe that was some of the fur that was sold in Portland. But at the time, the police could not get a case on them. That was their biggest defense. You know, you know, who knows where the weapons were. There were no witnesses. They didn't have enough to actually convict Charles Kimsey way back then. But we're all pretty sure that he did it. But nevertheless, because he was never tried and because you need someone to actually be convicted of a case to actively say, it's been solved, it's still regarded as an unsolved murder case. And something else that's really problematic, you know, you can never just have a really solid suspect. There always has to be something that suddenly makes you think, wow, maybe this wasn't the guy. When Kimsey was apprehended in Montana and he was being brought back to Oregon, the authorities that were bringing him back, they were already trying to see if they could get him to talk. And he was like, I know you're trying to hook me on them Lava Lake murders and I ain't answering none of your questions, which is suspicious in and of itself. If you're totally innocent, why wouldn't you just be like, nope, wasn't me? You know, was I there this time? Nope, wasn't me. But one of the main reasons that Kimsey vehemently denied being the guy was he claimed that during the winter when these murders happened, he was actually all the way over in Colorado helping with this construction of a big tunnel there. He even told a story about how on Christmas Day he sat inside the partially finished tunnel eating his Christmas dinner. And you think, okay, yeah, sure, whatever, you were in Colorado, yeah, we're all going to believe that. But apparently he was able to provide documentation that verified he was working with that crew in Colorado. So all of a sudden you're like, okay, now there's verification that he wasn't even in Oregon when these murders happened. But that being said, back in 1924, documentation like that, very, very easy to forge. I mean, you could make up, you know, any kind of document you want. If it looks at least moderately professional and realistic, you can present it and people will be like, oh, well, verification, you know. I'm not trying to knock law enforcement back in the day, but it would be very easy to, you know, get a few papers together and be like, oh yeah, I was over here during this time and here's my documentation. I mean, the guy had 9 years on the lam to, you know, prep for the potential that he might get caught one day and be put on trial. You know, that's more than enough time to forge a few documents. So, you know, maybe those documents are valid. I personally think that's not enough to give the guy a pass. That's not enough to just say, oh, the guy had an alibi and all that other stuff that happened. Well, you know, the hell with it. I still think this guy was probably the killer. And it's interesting, this 1923 attempted murder of this stagecoach driver, which authorities weren't even thinking about. They had bigger fish to fry with this triple homicide. They actually ended up charging him for that 1923 case. And part of the reason was they couldn't get enough stuff on him for this triple murder. and he was probably going to be freed before too long because they didn't have enough to hold him. So it was almost like a way of keeping him in prison and not allowing him to escape, potentially to never be found again. It was almost a way of keeping him around so they could finally someday build a case on him. That he was tried for that 1923 attempted murder and was actually given a life sentence for that. So, I mean, if you really think he committed these Lava Lake murders, and, you know, I'm about 95% certain he did, you can, in a twisted, roundabout way, say that justice was served because the guy did go to prison on a life sentence, granted for a different crime, but what are you gonna do, you know? And that, my friends, is the story of the Lava Lake murders, one of Oregon's oldest unsolved murders, where 3 men, presumably later January 1924, were attacked, presumably in their cabin, brutalized, shot to death, beaten. Again, there was probably multiple people involved, and that's why some of the brutality these men faced was a result of gunshot wounds. Other was blunt force trauma. One was probably using a gun for a while the other was using a weapon. Again, it's presumed it was a hammer or something along those lines. And these men were violently attacked. You know, maybe it was like one of those Old West stories. Charles Kinsey, or the murderer, with an accomplice or two, shows up outside of the cabin and says, "Hey, Nichols, step out here." And, you know, Nichols and his friends step out on the porch, and it's just there they are facing off. And that could explain the murder happening outside. And then, you know, with months passing, any blood that may have been on the scene could have easily gotten soaked into the snow, and then as the snow melts, it flows away and goes off to who knows where. It could have seeped into the mud and grass and whatever that's underneath that snow. It's understandable that not much was to be found at that cabin. While there's still the possibility that these murders happened there, I mean, the bodies obviously were taken on that sled, so it seems like they were all murdered near the cabin, put on the sled, and then dragged down to the lakes where their bodies were disposed of. And you have the bloody claw hammer there. Maybe that is the blunt instrument. You know, they said it was a hammer. So that was probably the blunt instrument that was used that for some reason they foolishly left behind at the crime scene. But again, it's rural Oregon, 1924. They probably figure ain't going to be a lot of people out here. If this case does get solved, it's probably going to be a very long time, and we'll be long gone, far away from here by then. But that's kind of the story that I go along with. And then, you know, the ending, hole gets cut in the water, their bodies get thrown in to just sink under and decompose under the ice of these lakes out in central Oregon. But, you know, at least a slight consolation is they were found. It's, in a case like this, it's very unlikely that victims who are killed in an area like this and disposed of the way they were would be found, and found so quickly. I know it sounds crazy to say, you know, 3 months went by before they were found. How can you say that that's a quick discovery? But for the time and place, that's actually, it's pretty remarkable that this wasn't one of those cases where it went cold for decades, and then, you know, the 1970s or 80s, people find random bones along the shoreline of the lake or whatever, and, you know, it's 50, 60 years later that they find the bones of the victims, and then they have to backtrack from there, and by then, you know, Charles Kimsey and Ray Van Buren Jackson and these possible suspects are likely dead and long gone. But yeah, it's a really, really troubling story, and it's just to think, you know, getting murdered like that out in the middle of nowhere. No one's gonna hear you if you scream for help in that scenario. Not a chance. So anyway, guys, as always, I hope you enjoyed this little story time delving into another of multiple unsolved murder cases that have happened in Oregon and the Pacific Northwest that just kind of span the course of time around here. I guess that happens when you got a lot of forested and mountainous regions up here. you're going to have these cases where people are killed and there's nobody around to witness it or hear it or anything. And all that said, remember, as always, I'm sick. Be nice to me today. Remember to like the video, share my videos if you so desire, and subscribe. That's the most important. You'll know when I'm posting, the moment I'm posting. And if you want to throw me a little sick money for my medical bills, aka making more videos, you can hit up my Patreon. The link is in the description, as always. If you want to help me out in that way, that would be most appreciated. And anyway, guys, my throat's getting pretty sore and hoarse, so I'm going to wrap it on that note. Till next time, guys, this has been Steve, the Amateur Historian.